Good evening, everyone. Sue here, and very excited about our science talks in general, and grateful to Wendy, who's on board here with our talk tonight. Wendy Felsen, who's been our queen coordinator of these science talks, which I'm super grateful for because they are a highlight of our months, and we get a lot of good response to them. And so please know, like Sarah said, to just keep yourselves muted for now. If any questions pop up during the talk, you can put them in the chat, and we can either, if we need to, we can answer them in the middle of the chat, or excuse me, in the middle of the presentation or towards the end. And then always know that we appreciate any kind of support. If you can make a donation to the science talks or donation to our organization, you can go to www.noyacenter.org and donate. Keep us afloat, keep us offering these incredible talks that we're so fortunate to do so. It looks like Trey's putting it up in the chat in case you need that reminder. And I'm going to two parts to my introduction here. I'm gonna just introduce Ari, our speaker of the evening, and then Sarah Grimes, our stranding coordinator, is gonna just update us on the latest information about what's going on with our whales off of our coastline currently. But before I pass it off to her, I just want to say that I was so fortunate to hear Ari speak in, I think it was 2014 at the American Cetacean Society conference down in Monterey Bay, and have been following his work ever since, just because I was so excited to hear about somebody doing kind of cutting edge studying, researching, using new methods and what have you, following the whales down in the Antarctic area, and just been fascinated by the continual work that he's been doing. We had his wife speak about elephant seals back in January, I think it was. So Ari is an associate researcher at UCSC, Santa Cruz Institute for Marine Science, director of research for the California Ocean Alliance, and has been responsible for pioneering development and use of tagging technology to study the behavior and ecology of whales around the world, and continues to do that research down in Antarctic, studying the Pacific and Atlantic whales. And his work is helping to develop an understanding of relationships between whales and the environment, which is a very timely conversation because, as we know, we're definitely seeing evidence of that in the news currently. And National Geographic has an incredible series. I think it's called Antarctica, or the Seventh Continents, or forgive me for not getting the title wrong, but it's an incredible series following some of the work that he's doing. So before we have him share his presentation this evening, I will pass off the baton to Sarah Grimes, our stranding coordinator, so she can catch us up on the latest of what's going on.
Yeah, sure. So it's really nice. I see that we've got Mo Flannery is here and Martha from down at Cal Academy of Sciences. And so they already know about this. But this afternoon, I heard from Justin Visbecki letting us know up in this area that there is an entangled whale that is moving up the coast. It was reported just between 3 and 4, and it was at Goat Rock and fairly close to shore to where people could see it and struggling. And so that is near Jenner, and that was this afternoon. And there's also a young gray whale. So there's 2 different entangled whales. This is not the gray whale calf that people have been talking about. But now both of those whales are kind of moving into this area, maybe, if they continue on their journey northward, which we kind of expect them to do. But the one at Jenner didn't look to be doing so good, according to the reporting party. This just means, don't catch a bunch of phone calls or anything. None of that is necessary unless you actually do see the entangled whale. Then you would call the Marine Mammal Center or SOS whale numbers and say where you're seeing it. Just if you're out there on the coast watching whales, I know I reached out to Scott and Tree Mercer down in the Point Arena area, and they are going to be looking tomorrow in that area, and we will all be in touch. You can happy to reach out to me, stranding coordinator in this area, if you have any questions. But yeah, just be on the lookout, and they're closer to shore than you would expect. Instead of being way out there, the mom and calf pair are kind of close to shore, and then this other whale, it sounded like it was fairly close, with a red floating behind it.
Sarah, is this new one a gray whale? also?
I believe so. I believe so, but I am not 100% sure that the reporting party identified it as such. Anyway, hang tight on that. Yeah, it's beautiful out. Cow-calf pairs are passing us by, so get out there and look at what's going on and take it in and enjoy it. And if you happen to see an entangled whale, definitely report in SOS Whale, or the Marine Mammal Center will get you right through to that. So that's about it from me for right now. So thanks everybody for being here. And I hand it over to Ari, our featured guest, and thank him so much for giving his evening to us.
Yes, most definitely.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Sue and Sarah, and everybody. I'm super excited to talk to you. When my wife Carolyn talked in January, she was so excited by what a fun audience you guys were that I was glad that I was going to get a chance to talk to you as well. And these are fun events for me because getting to talk to people who are as excited and passionate about learning and these animals is really kind of what feeds our lifeblood, and helps us, motivates us to do this kind of research. And it also helps us to understand what kinds of things are important for people and how to communicate things to different audiences. So I would really appreciate feedback at some point if there's things in this presentation that are particularly compelling to you, or if things are presented in ways that may not come across very well. I'm always sort of trying to increase our ability to communicate broadly about the things that we do. So I appreciate your feedback on this. I'll start sharing my screen. I'm going to just turn my video off. Obviously, while I'm doing it, you don't need to see me. But again, if people have questions throughout, somebody just interrupt me. Otherwise, we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, at the end to do so. And with that, let me share my screen. I think I just need to turn the presenter mode on. Oh, hold on one second. I'm just going to stop. Let me turn off my video first, and then I can do it. All right, great. So as Sue mentioned, one of the places that's very near and dear to my heart where I do a lot of my research is in the Antarctic. And it seems like an odd place to sort of call home, but it's a place that over the last 20 years or so has been very important to me and my colleagues, and where we've started to develop a lot of our research tools and techniques. And so what I wanted to sort of focus on tonight was sort of using different technologies and new tools that we have to study the secret lives of whales. And as you guys know, they can be really difficult to study. The fact that Sarah was mentioning there's a gray whale mom and calf close to shore is really exciting, because that means that animal is close by and we can get a good view of it. But for most animals and most of their life histories, they're sort of out of view more often than not. And so understanding what they do requires some kind of creativity and some fun tools. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that I thank the people and agencies that helped to make this possible. And the research I'm going to talk to you about tonight has been supported by a number of grants from the National Science Foundation, as well as by the World Wildlife Fund and the International Whaling Commission. My collaborators, who are a huge group of friends and colleagues from Stanford, from Duke University, from NOAA, from the Australian Antarctic Division, and elsewhere. And they're really what makes doing this research fun for me, is being able to do this with close friends. And I think it's always important to acknowledge those folks who wait for us at home while we're away in the field doing this far off stuff. So I'm very appreciative of that. As a little bit of background, while I may come off as looking very California, I actually grew up in Connecticut. I think I always had the soul of a California person, but I grew up on the shores of Connecticut. And one of the things about growing up in New England that you recognize is that whaling and whales have a very deep connection to the culture, to the economy, to the history, to the arts in that area. The image on the left is what Mystic Seaport looked like, or New Bedford, Massachusetts looked like during the Yankee whaling days. And whale oil literally lit the street lamps in that part of the world for hundreds of years. And so the connection to whales has undergone a great transformation from whales being a commodity, that were used commercially, to now being something that's viewed more as a part of the culture that we want to survive and protect. One of the things I didn't realize as I was growing up was that guy on the bottom left is a guy named Nathaniel Palmer. I grew up about 20 miles away from him. He's the first person to set foot on the Antarctic continent. He was a sealing captain from Stonington, Connecticut. And so while I grew up with whales and Antarctica as part of what was around me, I had no idea and no inkling that I would ever work in the Antarctic. I did my master's research on animal physiology and functional morphology. So I was effectively taught how animals work. What are the things that these animals have adapted or evolved that make them capable of living in the ocean and being successful at it? And then I did my PhD work at Duke University studying the ecology of whales in the Antarctic. And that's when I was introduced to this part of the world and tried to come up with ways and tools to be able to study animals in a very difficult place. 100 years ago or so, working in the Antarctic was a very different thing than it is today. And Apsley Cherry Gerard wrote in his book called The Worst Journey in the World, that polar exploration is at once the cleanest and most isolated way of having a bad time which has been devised. And I can empathize with him in some ways. It was a brutal place to go to. It was hard to survive, and doing science was even more difficult down there. And I'm very grateful to the big ships that we have now and the wonderful crews and captains that we work with. And I'll try and come back to this at the end, but it doesn't take a lot for us to survive down there now. We have a lot of support that allows us to do work in very relative comfort. So in terms of my kind of academic philosophy, I think there's a very strong overlap between understanding how animals are put together. And that, I think, tells you a lot about how animals are going to behave. The things that they have as adaptations are what's going to allow them to behave in certain ways. And the behavior of an animal when it relates to its environment is what ecology is. So I'm really interested in sort of this, these overlapping fields of how animals are adapted and how that affects their behavior, and how what they can do behaviorally impacts how they interact with their environment. And in order to do this, especially on marine mammals, we need to use technology. So we use things like echo sounders to study prey, to study krill patches or anchovies. And we have to develop tools like the telemetry devices to put on animals, because we can't see what they're doing when they're below the surface. And so understanding what they do requires technological advances. I think in terms of our output, me as a scientist, understanding science and nature for its heuristic value is wonderful, but I feel a sense of urgency and sort of a compelling sense of wanting to make our science have impact in conservation practice, in management, but also in education, and being able to do science that promotes education broadly and encourages people from underserved and underrepresented groups to get interested in science. If we can use whales as a tool to do this, then I think we're doing a good job. And I think whales, both ecologically as well as societally, are a really good vector to bring people in and to help us understand what makes oceans so important. So I'm going to talk tonight about minke whales. These are these little dudes that are circled in red. They're the smallest of the baleen whales. They're about the size of a gray whale calf, effectively. They are the most numerous baleen whale in the world. The Antarctic minke whales, there's several 100,000 of them in the Southern Ocean. They live in sea ice, which makes them really difficult to study. One of the few things that we do know about them is that they make a really bizarre call called the bioduck, which literally sounds like a duck quacking underwater. But because they live in a very remote place, there's very little that's known about their behavior. In the past, minke whales have been killed for scientific research, and a lot of the justification for having to kill them was because the governments that put in these requests said that there weren't ways or tools to study the feeding behavior or the reproductive biology of the animals in a way that didn't require them to be lethally sampled. And I'm happy to say that that's a load of crap, and that we have a lot of tools at our disposal that I'll talk to you about tonight that allow us to do that in a non-lethal way that has zero impact on these animals. But they're also a species that may be very affected by climate change. And I'll sort of come back to that at the end, how what we are doing can help inform us about the impacts of climate change in the Antarctic. Now, one thing that I think is really cool about baleen whales is that they represent a group of whales, a group of animals that have had repeated independent evolution of becoming very big by eating very small things in the ocean. So over the last 100 million years, from manta rays to whale sharks to basking sharks to megamouths to baleen whales, there have been a number of different groups of animals that have evolved this massive body size and a feeding mechanism that is based on filter feeding, opening your mouth and filtering out a lot of very small things. So in the ocean, if you want to get big, you eat small things. If you don't want to become the biggest thing, you eat single prey items. And we published a paper in Science a couple of years ago that Jeremy Goldbogen led that showed that in marine mammals, killer whales are really limited in their body size because they feed on individual prey items, and there's not a lot of those around. And so that is going to limit the upper limits, the upper end of your size that you can grow to based on the resources available to you. But all of these other animals, including baleen whales, have so much food that's available to them at the lower trophic levels that that's what allows them to get as big as they do. Now, you need to be able to catch food. And one of the things that baleen whales can do is take in an enormous amount of water when they lunge feed. So what you see here is a blue whale on the flensing deck in South Georgia, and you can see these pleats going from underside of the chin here, basically all the way down to the umbilicus. And the mouth on that animal is about half the length of its body. And by doing a little math, what we were able to show was that if you're an 18-meter long baleen whale, which is, let's call it a fin whale, every time you open your mouth underwater and you fill that distended buccal cavity with water, you're engulfing a volume of water that is effectively the same amount as your body weight. So if that whale weighs 40 tons, it can fit 40 tons of water in its mouth at one time. Now, that doesn't mean it's 40 tons of prey, but if you can find dense areas of prey, you can certainly get a lot of food very quickly. And this scales with body size. So when you are a blue whale that's 24 meters long, you can fit over 130% of your body weight in water in your mouth at once, which is an incredible thing, and it makes you incredibly efficient. You don't have to feed all that often if you can find really dense prey and fit that much of it into your mouth at one time. Now, at the other end of the scale, a little minke whale can only get about 75% of its body weight, but that's still pretty amazing. I mean, imagine putting 100-pound burrito in your mouth, at once. It can't happen for us, but these guys have evolved adaptations that allow them to feed in this way. And this is one of the ways that you get big, is by being able to eat a lot of food and eat a lot of food very quickly. Now, there are impacts to how big your mouth is. And what this graph shows you in orange is the number of times that an animal can feed underwater on a given dive. These animals are holding their breath. Energy and doing exercise underwater takes oxygen. So it's going to limit how much you can do underwater on one breath. So a minke whale, going from left to right, you have minke whales, humpbacks, fins, and blues. Minke whales are able to lunge over 20 times on a given dive. That's almost like they're Pac-Man. They're basically eating continuously, taking these little bites out of the water as they go. Whereas blue whales can only lunge 5 or 6 times because it takes so much energy and so much time for them to open their mouth, close it, expel the water, push it all out, and swim on to their next place. On the flip side, because a blue whale's mouth is so big, in the same amount of time, a blue whale can filter about 16 times more water than a minke whale can in an hour. So even if they're only feeding, 25% as much, they're filtering out 16 times more water because of the size of that mouth, which is pretty remarkable. All right, so as researchers, we have to come up with different tools to answer specific questions. And on the right here are just some of the myriad ways that scientists have come up with to be able to study animals. And so we could use things like satellites to give us information about ocean conditions. We can use drones, like this image that you see here was taken by a drone that we were working with in the Antarctic, that can allow you to measure the length of whales or individual whales or their body condition. We use passive acoustics to listen to these animals, to tell us about where they're present and the noises they make. We use biopsy sampling, small skin and tissue samples, to tell us about pregnancy status or diets or contaminant loads. And in the middle there is tagging. And that's the one that I want to talk mostly about tonight, using telemetry devices to study the underwater behavior of whales. So this is the environment that we're working in. And this video is a little big, so it may be a little choppy, but this is the inshore waters of the Antarctic Peninsula where we work, the area that's south of South America. And you see that the ocean, it's very calm here, but it's a very dynamic ocean. You see lots of pieces of small sea ice. You see some open water. You see some small icebergs. You see some very large icebergs. And we generally don't think of the surface of the ocean as being dynamic or as being variable. But in a place like the Antarctic, with all this sea ice coming from glaciers and from the ocean freezing during the winter, it's a very different place than the open ocean. When the wind blows in one direction, it can push all the ice to one side of the bay, and it can be 100% ice cover, which is impenetrable for some animals, or it could be very dynamic and spread out like this. But it's a condition that changes very quickly, and there are certain animals that have evolved to be able to take advantage of living in an environment like this. So what I'm going to talk tonight about is how we are using a suite of emerging technologies to increase our knowledge of a very poorly known species. And right now, basically what we're trying to do is characterize the behavior of these animals, understand what they do and how they do it, and help us understand what it is that these animals need to survive and how we can protect them. And these are Antarctic minke whales, and these are the guys that we're going to talk about tonight. So this is probably the most meaningful image that we've taken of these guys. Before we started going down to the Antarctic and had dedicated time to study minke whales, I put out 2 tags in about 13 years of work down there. And then we got a grant from the NSF to go down and look for these guys specifically. And we put out 35 tags over the course of 2 seasons. And we are learning every hour of data we look at, we're learning something new about these animals. There's a lot that you can learn just from this one image. So the fact that you have 5 minke whales together was something that we weren't really familiar with. We thought these were solitary animals. Maybe they were in pairs. We very oftentimes see them in groups. Another thing that's really beautiful about these animals is their color patterns, and those are individually distinctive. You can see this beautiful chevron across the back of the animal, and that differs among animals. You can see there's kind of these 2, they almost look like smoke trails coming out of the blowholes of the animals. And some of them go to the left, some of them go to the right. The white sort of saddle on the haunches of the animal next to the dorsal fin are unique to each individual. And the distinctive patterns, I think, are just remarkable. This to me is such a meaningful image because you can count 4 of the 5 animals in this image have tags on them. And this is something that excites us because we can now start studying how these animals interact with each other, how the behavior of one animal is affected by the other one, and learn a lot more about what these animals do in groups. Another thing you can learn just by looking at these animals is where they go. So these are 2 images of minke whales that were taken about a minute apart. These are animals in the same group, and the animal on the left looks very different from the one on the right. The one on the left has this kind of brown, orangish kind of gunk on it. These are diatoms, and this is a whale that we think has been in the Antarctic for a very long time. What we found is that whales in the Antarctic don't shed their skin very frequently when they're in very cold water. So this animal here has gone through a season where these little diatoms have been able to grow on the skin of that animal, whereas the animal on the right has made a migration out of the Antarctic. It's gone up to the tropics. It's shed its skin where those diatoms can't live, come back to the Antarctic, and you see it's got a lot of these white scars on it. Those are cookie cutter shark bites. And cookie cutter sharks are only found in the tropics. And so we can tell the animal on the right has gone to the tropics pretty recently. The animal on the left stayed in the Antarctic over winter. So right there, just by looking at photographs of animals, we can tell that there are differences in how certain animals behave. Now, whether the one on the left is an immature animal, we don't know. Whether the one on the right is a female that was going to give birth, we don't know. But it tells us that the population doesn't all do the same thing at the same time. And that's pretty interesting. Now, if I was smart and I wanted to study the behavior of animals, I'd either do what my wife does or do what Jane Goodall has done. And you immerse yourself with the animals. You sit back with a pen and a paper, you watch animals, you look at individuals, you get to know what each of them is doing, and you can see in a continuous way how animals behave, how as things change in their environment, the animals respond to that. Well, obviously whales, we don't have that option with. So the tags that we've developed are sort of our next best thing. And this is a tag that we've been using for the last 6 or 7 years. It's developed by a company in Australia. It's non-invasive. It applies to the animal with suction cups. It's only meant to stay on the animal for 1 or 2 days at a time, and then it falls off, floats to the surface. It has a VHF beacon as well as a GPS on it, so we can locate the tag after that, pick it up, download all of the data, recharge the batteries, and send it back out again. And then the tag itself contains accelerometers and magnetometers and gyros that are very similar to what are in your smartphones that allow us to recreate the orientation of the animal. We can look at its pitch, its movement up and down, its roll from left to right, or its heading in a lot of, in high frequency. We obviously also know things about the depth and the temperature. The tags also have a hydrophone, so we're recording all the sounds that the animals make, as well as all the sounds that they would be hearing. And then the great thing about these tags is they also have a video camera on them. So we can see from the animal's perspective what the animal is doing, what it's encountering, and that can give us some insights into the context for why animals may behave in certain ways. If you're in a lot of sea ice, does that mean you're doing certain things differently? If you're with other animals, does that mean you're behaving in different ways than if you're alone? And that video camera gives us the opportunity to see what the whale is doing at the time that it's doing certain behaviors. So, yes.
Excuse me, I have a great question. Janae was wondering if shedding skin is something that all whales do or if it's unique to minke whales.
Good question. All whales do it. All whales are almost constantly sloughing off their skin. Some do it in kind of big chunks. Some of them do it rather consistently. We know, like, for example, killer whales in the Antarctic make migrations up to tropical waters in the middle of the feeding season. They boom up to the tropics, turn around and come right back down to the Antarctic with a sort of a fresh new paint job. But it's a very continuous thing that's occurring in animals all the time. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. So while we've collected a lot of data on these animals, the line at the bottom is really what I'm most excited about. And that's that this project alone that we've been doing is supporting more than 20 undergrad students at Duke, at Stanford, at UC Santa Cruz, and a number of other places, as well as graduate and postdoctoral researchers. And being able to collect data and have it be used broadly like this is really what, to me, is exciting about doing this science. And I'm always excited when someone wants to use our data and play with it and learn something new from it. So this is what the tag looks like on a minke whale. This is a nice curious critter coming up to us, probably a 6 or 7 meter long animal. And you can see that the tag relative to the body size of the animal is quite small. And we feel very comfortable and confident that once we put these tags on, it's not affecting the behavior of the whale in any way, and it's not causing any sort of undue or additional stress to the animal, so that the behaviors that we see on the tag, we think represent natural behavior of those animals. Here's how we get the tag on. This is obviously the most fun part. We use a long carbon fiber pole. I stand in the pulpit of a Zodiac. Our expert drivers kind of get us close. And if a minke whale is interested in volunteering for our research project, it surfaces close enough where we can put a tag on it. And sort of that's the business end, just putting a tag on. The animals, again, just go about their business very quickly afterwards. And yeah, it's one of the most magical things you can do. I feel extremely fortunate that that's part of my job, and that I'm able to work with such cool animals. This next one, this is a view from a helmet cam that I'm wearing. One of the things we learned about minke whales is they like to bow ride. And we get these animals that just sit right in front of the Zodiac, you know, for minutes at a time and just kind of cruise around with us. Boom, the animal surfaces, you put a tag on and it swims away. Now, of course, it works perfectly like this every time, and conditions are beautiful and the whales are always cooperative. But in reality, I'm only going to show you when it works. And when it works, it looks really easy, but it does take quite a bit of time. And one of the things that makes us better is the more time we spend with these animals, the more we understand their behavior and the more we can respond to them, and the more we find out when the animals are approachable, in what kind of behavioral state can we get close to them? Because if they don't want us around, they just swim away. So we're learning about animals in that respect, which is really helpful. All right, So this is kind of the spaghetti plot. This is effectively the tracks of 15 or 20 minke whales. So the dark blue is the water around the Antarctic Peninsula. The white is the land. And on the right side, Andvord Bay, Paradise Bay, these are very near shore bays, very secluded bays with lots of glaciers around them. The Gerlache Strait is a big area of open water. And so what you see here, each of the little circles here indicates a dive of an animal. The green circles are just where we put the tag on. A gray circle means the animal was transiting. An orange circle means the animal was feeding. And so one of the things just looking at the animal tracks from this view is you can see the animals spend almost all of their time deep inside these bays. They also spend a lot of their time feeding. Where are they not feeding? It's generally when they are in these open water areas and when they're moving into places like the Gerlache Strait, which again, they don't do very frequently. The reason? That's where killer whales live. And if you're a minke whale, the one thing that you're concerned about is getting eaten by a killer whale. So the bays like Andvord Bay, like I mentioned, that's where the sea ice is. That's where there's lots of coastline, a lot of places for these animals to hide out and make a living versus going into this sort of danger zone. And you can see when they do go into that danger zone, they move very quickly. They move in a straight line, trying to get across the road like in what's the video game, Frogger. You know, you're trying to get across the road before a big thing comes and squashes you. And that's basically, I think, what minke whales are trying to do. So just by looking at the tracks of animals, I get a feeling that these are animals that like to be very close to shore or like to be in these embayments where there might be sea ice. And that's a place that they feel safe and comfortable. Now, how do we tell when an animal feeds? This is a tag that's now on the back of a minke whale. You're on the left side of the whale. The dorsal fin is down here in the bottom right corner. Up in the top left here, this is going to show you the orientation of the whale. So when it's pitched up or down, rolling left or right, all the numbers here on the left will change as the animal moves. But the panel that's most important for us to look at is this one here with depth on it. So the dark blue line is the depth of the animal. The green is the speed of the animal. And the pink that you see here is what we call the jerk signal, or just how much motion or acceleration there is in that animal. And just going to forward this a little bit. This line here represents where we are in the track. So now we're on the back of a minke whale that's swimming underneath the ice in the Antarctic. So that video camera is fantastic because it's telling us this animal's swimming under sea ice right now. Hot off the presses stuff. Not many people have seen this stuff, but it's pretty amazing. Now the animal's going to go on a dive right here. You see it's pitched downward. Then it's going to turn right back up towards the surface. It's accelerating. Right there, it opens its mouth. And you see all the krill pass by that the animal didn't get. Obviously, it got a bunch of them in its mouth. But that was a feeding event. That was a feeding lunge that the whale did. And what the video allows us to do is say, that animal is feeding underneath sea ice. And so every time this whale comes to the surface, we can say, was that animal in sea ice or was it in open water? And if you look at 8,000 or 10,000 dives, you can get a pretty good idea about how frequently does this animal feed under sea ice versus feeding in open water, for example. And that's a critical piece of information that tells us about how important sea ice is to the lives of these animals. That was another feeding lunge right there. So we use the video to also corroborate the behavior of the animal so that when we have data that isn't accompanied by video, we can look at these sensors and pull out all of the information we need on when the animal fed, how deep was it, how many times did it feed on a dive, by looking for these signatures, this high jerk signal, this very big change in speed. Animals doing it again. I told you they're like Pac-Man, right? So it's fed 3 times in the last 30 seconds that I've been kind of blathering on. And it's going to do it another time if I let this go, for another 5 or 10 seconds. So I mentioned that these animals feed in groups or are pretty social. This is one of the most amazing views we have of a minke whale in that group of 5 or 6. It's a little deep, but you get to see not only the animal that's tagged, but you get to see these other animals feeding in concert with them. Boom, that guy just took a bite. Now, what's really cool is look at this guy on the right as he passes by. Oh, there's 3 animals lunging at the same time. That's pretty amazing. This guy's got a tag on it. So this is great. We can say this is another tagged animal. How did that behavior of the tagged animals relate to one another? So this kind of group feeding or coordinated feeding is something we had no idea happened in minke whales until we had video that would corroborate it. If we put out one tag on one animal, we would have no idea that these animals were in groups at all. But because we have video, we can now see that these animals are feeding in concert. There's 6 minke whales right there, all lunging at the same time. That's a really advanced kind of predation and a way of coordinating your behavior to try and increase your efficiency by doing things like this. And this is something that, again, we had no idea about until we started looking at these videos. All right, now minke whales also like to have a little bit of fun. I just like to play this video because it reminds me and it reminds us that these animals are curious, that they're not just these kind of machines that are feeding in the ocean. This is a minke whale that found a jellyfish. You know, what the heck is a minke whale doing with a jellyfish? Well, it seems like it's swimming up to it, puts it on its nose, kind of swims around with it for a little bit. To me, this is just an animal that's completely curious about something it's in its environment. It just shredded the poor jellyfish apart, but it seems to me that this animal is just doing that kind of for the fun of it. These are, like I said, they're curious little animals, and we're learning that about them. All right, so I mentioned sort of that sea ice before. This is a really cool image. You can see this animal is looking straight up. There's 100% ice cover here. This is all brash ice or glacial rubble. What's this minke whale do? It's like, I want to be one of the ice cubes. So I'm just going to park myself in the sea ice for a little bit here. This is really fun, right? The ice kind of floats away. The whale's literally just sitting. Actually, there's a second minke whale right in front there that you can see his nose sticking up. You'll see this animal take a breath in a second. Right there, you see the blowholes open. And this animal just sits in the sea ice for like 10 or 15 minutes. And I thought minke whales were always on the move, these kind of neurotic little whales. Well, we've come to find out minke whales just like to sit in the sea ice for a long time. It's a great place to avoid predation. No one's ever going to see you if you're just sitting in the ice. And every once in a while, when they want to take a break, this is what they do. It's amazing. I love it. I love it about them. So one of the cool things that a couple undergrads in our lab did was they used this video data to tell us about the habitat of these animals. So like you saw in that video, every time the animal comes to the surface, what they would do is they would count how much sea ice the animal was in, whether it was 0%, 20%, 100%. And then we could calculate the field of view, how big an area we were seeing, and we could start to link up how much the animals are feeding under sea ice. When they're socializing or when they're vocalizing, how much of that occurs in open water versus sea ice. And understanding these metrics give us an idea about what the habitat requirements are for these animals so that we can forecast and say, okay, if conditions are going to change so that there is X amount of sea ice, how is that going to affect these animals? If there's only sea ice for this part of the year versus another part of the year, how is that going to affect the amount of available habitat for these guys? So we're letting the animals tell us about how they use their environment, and we're taking advantage of the technology to measure that. Now, one of the fun things we do with the data is we animate it and put it into 3-dimensional space so that we can see how the animals are using the water, not just in 2 dimensions. So this is a program called TrackPlot that we developed with some programmers at the University of New Hampshire. The ribbon is the track of the whale. The blue and the red triangles that you see are when the animal is actively fluking or kicking. The yellow is just where the animal has sort of rolled over onto its side. But what this allows you to do is see how the animals use space. If the animal's going to start finding a food patch here, it's going to accelerate and lunge, and then turn back and go right back through that prey patch, accelerate and lunge. This is sped up quite a few times. This is not real time, but this is a very intuitive way for us to see how animals use space, what they do underwater. We can also learn things about their buoyancy. The animal's coming up from depth and it has to kick actively to get to the surface, meaning that that animal is negatively buoyant versus an animal that was positively buoyant that would have to expend energy on the way down to get deep and then would come to the surface much more simply. So we use tools like this in concert with things like the video and the sensors to tell us about the space use of these animals. And I think it's a really compelling way for us to look at the data. Now, one of the things we're really interested in with these animals is when they feed. And so what we've done here is we've cruised what's called a heat map to tell us about where in the water column and when during the day minke whales feed. So from top to bottom, this is the surface, shallow water, deeper water. We're going on the left from dawn to the middle of the day, which is right around day period 10. And then we're in dusk. And then all of nighttime is on the right-hand side here. And what the colors represent is how much the animals are feeding. So very dark blue means the animals are not feeding. Lighter blue means a little bit, green a bit more. Yellow is like they're going bonkers. And what you see is a really cool pattern. So during the day, these are all the day hours on the left. The only feeding that minke whales are doing is in deep water, and they're not doing very much of it. But then you see this transition right at nighttime to becoming more active in the surface, and they go absolutely crazy. And they're feeding at super, super high rates at the surface at nighttime. Well, how this relates to their environment is where things like echo sounders come in. So if we look at the distribution of prey during the day, what you have here is what we call an echogram. So the red line is the bottom. All the black stuff underneath that is just an echo of the bottom of the ocean. And then these things that look like colorful clouds are patches of krill. The more intense red colors indicate the density, higher density areas. What you see here during the day, it's hard to read, but these krill patches are down pretty deep, 150, 200 meters in the water. Even though they're big patches, they're pretty deep. And the whales are feeding on them when they're deep, but they're not feeding very much. Now, if we look at the prey during the nighttime, we see a very different situation. So that same amount of prey has now moved up to much closer to the surface and consolidated into these very, very dense patches. So the animals are making a conscious decision and saying, I can either feed during the day when I've got to dive down and search for these prey, and they're not going to be very dense, or I can wait until the nighttime comes. The prey is going to come to the surface. It's going to be really dense, and it's going to be right there for me and available for me. If I know that and I can figure that out, that's a good idea. And the minke whales, you can see how they have changed their behavior or modified their behavior to feed when it's most efficient for them, when the prey is closest to the surface and when it's the most dense. And that's a really important thing for us to be able to understand. All right, so just to kind of summarize some of these kind of cool things we've learned about Antarctic minke whales. Incredibly high feeding rates. They can feed 25 times on a given dive. They can feed over 100 times an hour, over 1,200 times in a 24-hour period. Hugely impressive feeding rates. They show this diel foraging pattern, or a difference from day to night. And this mimics or it mirrors the prey movement in the water column, and they adjust their foraging to maximize that. There's group feeding in these animals that you saw in the video, and that's actually really common in these guys. And we think that it's likely one of the things that helps to make foraging more efficient. They largely remain in these coastal bays, and they associate with sea ice when it's present. As you guys saw that in that first sort of spaghetti image that I showed you. There's an increasing potential for competition in the Antarctic as conditions change. So there are animals like humpback whales, blue whales, fin whales, that are all open water animals. And as the conditions in this area change and there's less and less sea ice, the animals that don't like sea ice have more habitat, and the amount of habitat that's available for these minke whales decreases. There's also a krill fishery in this area that is becoming a bigger and bigger threat, and understanding where they operate relative to where the whales feed is something that we need to be very aware of. All right, let me talk quickly about climate change in the Antarctic to give you guys some perspective. So this is a satellite image looking at the Antarctic continent. The purple stuff that you see is sea ice. So the Antarctic Peninsula is here on the left. This is the southern tip of South America on the far left of the image. This is April, which is sort of fall. This is when sea ice starts to build. So I'm going to go from April to May to June to July, August, into the winter, and watch the sea ice grow around the Antarctic continent. It's amazing how much sea ice grows, about twice the size of the United States in area. Now, where's the one place where there's not sea ice? Well, it's the Antarctic Peninsula. It's right here, the one place where we have the ability to work. The one place in the Antarctic that doesn't get a lot of sea ice in the winter is the Antarctic Peninsula. That's because in this area, the air temperatures have increased by over 5 degrees Celsius, or about 8 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 50 years. Instead of having about 200 days that were covered by ice annually, there's now only about 120. And there's no winter sea ice in some places. So in this part of the Antarctic, it may not be a very good place for minke whales in the future if they require sea ice to have a habitat. All right, another thing that's really sort of raised a flag to us is on the left is an Antarctic minke whale. Beautiful drone image of that whale. You see that beautiful chevron across the back here, the nice white patches near the dorsal fin, the very long pointy rostrum, those nice kind of smoky wisps coming out of the blowhole. Well, the animal on the right is a minke whale that we photographed in the Antarctic, but it's not an Antarctic minke whale. That's a dwarf minke whale, much more similar to the minke whales we see in California. Very white pectoral fins, a much shorter, kind of wider snout, none of the saddle patches across the back. This is a dwarf minke whale that lives in tropical waters. There's a population that lives in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. What's it doing in the Antarctic? It's not a species that we should be seeing in the Antarctic. But because those waters are warming, because the conditions are not ice riddled anymore, it's opening the door for species that are not typically found there to make their way down. And we need to be vigilant, and we need to take these as warning signs that conditions are changing very quickly in this part of the world. Another thing that we need to do is to use this information to help develop protected areas. California is phenomenal. If you look at our coastline, the amount of area that's protected as sanctuaries or important areas is huge. And we need this information, like what we're gaining in the Antarctic, to be able to set aside areas that are changing quickly, that are important for these animals, and that minimize the amount of human activity there that could have a negative consequence to them. And lastly, I think it's really important for us to be able to share this information broadly. One of the things that I get to do is I get to collaborate with artists like this woman, Yolandi Harris, who's in the bottom. She's a professor in the art department at UC Santa Cruz. We did a couple of really cool installation exhibits in Santa Cruz using the video data, and she made a musical score to go along with it. And we've shown this at a number of different galleries around the world. It's really fantastic to be able to communicate with different communities like artists. We're very fortunate that we have a good sort of media engine that we work with, especially folks like at WWF. There's been, dozens and dozens news articles and over 70 million people viewing the work that we do. We did a piece with ABC Nightline, I think is what the program was, that got nominated for an Emmy last year. So a lot of the work that we're doing is starting to get highlighted in more and more mass media outlets, and that's a great thing. It's not, I don't care about it for our own edification, but for the knowledge to be out there that the things that we do as humans, not only does it impact us in our own backyard, but it can have very broad ranging impacts all the way in places like the Antarctic. And we think about the Antarctic as being such a difficult and a horrible place, like Apsley Cherry Gerard mentioned, but it's also one of the most fragile places. When you are in extreme environment, you're really on a knife edge. And if things change a little bit, it has a huge impact. Versus in the tropics, if it's 85 degrees or 88 degrees, it's still warm, So the poles are very vulnerable places, and we need to be able to keep that in mind when we're talking about changing our behaviors and modifying what we do. And then lastly, I just wanted to leave you guys with this really kind of fun video. For me, studying Antarctic minke whales is the best journey in the world. These are magical animals. They're curious, they're sentient. This is a cute little juvenile. You can see he's been tagged because he already came over once to check us out. But this is an animal that lives in an environment that people are foreign to. And the response of this animal to humans is curiosity. It's absolutely as curious about us as we are of it. And we take this kind of stewardship to be able to keep these animals around and keep the habitats that are critical to them as functioning as possible, so that that little animal can be a big animal, and that the only interactions that it has with people are good ones, that it swims away from this feeling good about itself, and that we're not a threat. And I hope that the research we're doing can impact people to feel the same way and do things in their lives that can help animals. And I appreciate the chance to talk to you guys. My contact information, my website for our lab is on the top if you're interested in any of the other research projects we're doing. There's my email as well. I'd love to chat with people. And if there's things that you're interested about or had questions that we don't get to here, I'm happy to answer them. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn my video on. And I'm happy to take some questions if anybody has anything, or just hear what you guys have to say. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Ari. That was fantastic. Sarah, did you want to read questions from the chat? I can
Yeah,
go.
we got a couple of good questions. One, curious about the harvesting of krill. Is that done at night down there? Is it big nets scooping up lots of krill kind of situation?
Yeah, it's large commercial trawlers. They take about, I think it's about 400 tons annually. They largely fish in the Antarctic fall. Day or night, I think we're learning a little bit more from the industry as they provide information to us. We have a project going on right now with one of my postdocs where we're modeling how the krill fishery behaves relative to whales, and showing that they're basically the same kind of predators, looking for the same kinds of things. And if you look at the track of a boat and of a whale, they're very similar. So they definitely try and be as efficient as they possibly can at collecting food. And we're trying to make sure that they don't do it in places and times that are critical for whales.
Right, wonderful. Good that you're there keeping, I mean, yeah, all of this, just the minke whale, the elusive minke whale. It's just incredible stuff that you've brought up and just showed us. My goodness. I have another question about how much is known about their breeding behavior, and when do they breed and where? So I guess
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Some colleagues of ours that work in the horrible French Polynesia area of Moorea just published a paper recently where they had an Antarctic minke whale mom and calf, and they've seen several of them over the last few years. We've put a few satellite tags out on these whales that have shown that they go into the tropics, and we basically know that they breed in the tropics, and that they make these migrations that aren't close to shore like gray whales and humpbacks do. It's more in sort of open ocean areas. It's very likely that the animals are probably breeding in the Antarctic, but they're giving birth in the tropics.
Huh. Interesting. So not the breeding and calving kind of scenario.
There may be some of both. It's
Okay.
just like there's not a concentration of animals that's easily identifiable like you see with humpback whales.
Right. Interesting. More dispersed. And
Much more dispersed. Yeah.
they are different from the minke whale that we have up here.
Yeah, I mean they're geographically different. I mean they're minke whales. They could probably interbreed, but they are geographically isolated, and the populations are genetically different.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, I think going to sea up here, I don't think I have ever seen a minke whale. I think Jeff Jacobson has, he's here. The only two that I've seen have been deceased and on the shore.
Yeah.
Sadly, but beautiful. Thanks for putting the spotlight on them, and those images are just to die for. I think we all had the biggest grins on our faces watching that interaction. I hope people will ask questions. Here's another question.
Let's say we have another one.
Let's see. Recent news feeds talk about changing eddies and sea currents due to climate change. Is this reflected in whale migration?
That's a good question. There's a paper that came out earlier this week by folks at Point Blue and at the Tiburon Labs that looked at, over the last 25 years or so, the timing of migration of different baleen whales up the California coast. And they were able to show that there have been changes in the timing of when animals arrive that are impacted at annual scales by productivity, or when currents are doing certain things, how much upwelling there is, and that there are long-term trends. And then each year there are these interannual trends or variability that are directly related to changing sea conditions. Yeah.
I was muted. Sorry. It looks like Wendy's got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. How big is the population down there?
It's a very good question. It's very difficult to get an accurate estimation because most of those animals live in sea ice and you can't take a boat into that area. Um, the best guess around the entire Antarctic is that there's probably a few 100,000 minke whales just based on the densities that are reported and the amount of sea ice that there is. But in the Antarctic Peninsula, it's probably hundreds. You know, it's a much, much smaller population, but they're really hard to measure how many there are. And that's a real challenge for us.
Are they endangered at all?
No,
Or,
they're not an endangered species.
oh, that's good.
Yeah, when you, that 100,000, what did you say, few 100,000?
A couple 100,000, yeah,
Couple
around the
100,000.
entire Antarctic. Yeah.
And then you think about what are where are gray whales here, you know, the Eastern Pacific gray whale
Yeah,
down
about a
to
tenth of that.
whatever, 23, 24,000,
Yeah.
or the blue whale, our blue whale, which we're all pretty familiar with up here.
Yeah.
There's only a couple thousand off of our coast in the Pacific in
Yeah.
this area.
We know a boatload more about blue whales than we do about minke whales. I'll tell you that, you know. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, thank you for studying them. Let's see, are they hunted?
So I mentioned earlier on that they were the subject of a scientific whaling that was done by the Japanese as part of a research permit through the International Whaling Commission. They no longer do that. Japan has actually left the IWC. So Antarctic minke whales are not harvested in any commercial way or research way anymore.
That's good news.
It is good news. They deserve a break.
Any other questions for Ari? Let's see. Oh yes, here come the questions. Let's see if folks, if you want to just chime in, Kate, I see that you've asked a question. If folks want to unmute, that's fine with me. To unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Or I will read it. Let's see. Kate, hi. Did you want to ask yourself? Did you want to ask, or do you
It
want
says that she doesn't have any sound on her computer.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Sue. Great. So is anyone studying the anthropogenic impacts on the minke whales?
Yeah, what we're trying to do is look at the impacts of changing ice conditions, which are an anthropogenic one.
Mhm.
We also have the ability to look at the amount of tourism in the Antarctic and how much shipping activity there is in the areas. Unfortunately, but the bays that the minke whales live in are also the places where tourist ships go to. And I've got a PhD student who is starting in the fall, and she is going to be looking at the impacts of tourism on stress hormone levels in whales that we'll measure with a drone, that we can measure stress hormones in the breath and also from blubber samples. And then we'll also look at the behavior of the animals. And now that we have a lot of tag data that shows us what these animals do when there's no people around, we can look and we can put tags on animals or just do focal follows of animals when boats are around and see if there are differences in how the animals behave, how they vocalize, and the patterns that they exhibit when there's people around. Yeah, and that's great. The tour industry is supportive of that. They're giving us berths on these ships to be able to do those studies, which is really kind of them.
Nice, nice. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, what a fantastic presentation, Ari. Thank you so very much. I'm curious about how many months of the year you spend in Antarctica, and you go through Ushuaia, and do you fly there, or do you take a ship over? And give us what it is being in Antarctica is like for you.
Yeah, I've done it all. I mean, I've done all of those, and we do sort of all of those. I feel very lucky that we have had a lot of success getting funding through the National Science Foundation. I work with the Australian Antarctic Division for about 5 or 6 years, going out of Hobart in Tasmania. And over the last, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years, the tour industry has really latched on to what we're doing. And it's a wonderful mutual benefit because they bring us on board as scientists and they sell that opportunity for tourists to be able to see science and hear from scientists and sort of witness it firsthand. And it's a value added to the cruise as long as we get the opportunity to do the work and we can get taken to these places. So it's worked out brilliantly. I prefer a little bit of both. The dedicated time on the science ships is unique. The food sucks and the sauna is always broken. And on the tour ships, after a hard 2 or 3 hours on the water, I can come home and I can, sit in a hot tub for a minute or something. And, but I really like the opportunity to have people with us firsthand. And so that we can be communicating and educating while we're doing the science. And it's a feedback for me, because like I said at the beginning, we learn about what's important for people. What do people want to know? And that should drive in some ways what science we're doing, so that we can answer those questions, so that people that are interested get fed that information. And that's going to make them more interested, kind of more hooked on it a little as well. In terms of the season, we are down there. We have people down there from our team from about Thanksgiving to the end of March, maybe early April. Before I had a family, I was down there probably 3 or 4 months of the year. Now I pick and choose a little bit more. I spend about 2 months of the year down there, and depending on the project, we're doing things at different times of the year, depending on the project. The only month I don't think I've been in the Antarctic, I think, is October. But every other month of the year I've been down there in some, at one year or the other. I think I've made probably about, 45 trips down there at this point.
Is there one tour agency that you would, a ship that you would recommend over others? I've been on the Cork one, and it was fabulous, and can't wait to go again. So
Excellent.
What do you recommend?
Yeah. Honestly, I think it depends on what kind of experience you want. There are small ships that are a little bit more Spartan, and the experience is more about being off the boat and being in the water and being away from things. If you're someone that wants to be on a larger boat where you are taking in bigger views, there are platforms that allow you to do that. And then there's ones in the middle that kind of do a little bit of each. Most of the companies are really good and are really good stewards, and they self-regulate, and they have their own, organization that manages their behavior very well. I work a lot with, the folks from Cork very well. They run a great ship. Herta does fantastic stuff. I really like them. They have a foundation that supports our science. Lindblad National Geographic has been good throughout the years. Crystal Cruises is another one that's promoting a lot of science on their ships. Viking Cruises is new to the Antarctic, but they're a huge company around the world, and they're supporting a lot of science as well. And then there are a few kind of smaller private ones as well. So if folks are interested, I talk for hours about those different ones, but Cork is great. Cork is a great company for sure.
So Tony's wondering about those tags being such incredible tags, which they are. And have you used them on other species of whales? I think.
Oh yeah, yep.
Yeah.
We use different tags for different purposes, right? So this suction cup tag is specifically designed for baleen whales. We have a smaller version of that without video cameras. I think I've tagged about 20 species of cetaceans, probably put out about 1,000 tags, but all of the baleen whales species we've tagged at this point. Beaked whales, pilot whales, killer whales, rhesus dolphins,
Right.
bottlenose dolphins, sperm whales. So a fair number of the smaller toothed whales as well, but all of the baleen whales are sort of in our range.
Incredible. Boy, that really gives us such a window into their
Oh, yeah.
life, just watching a whale go down and open its mouth and feed.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
It's really cool. And then I have another question here. Have you listened to their songs, and do you grasp anything curious about their songs, about the Minke whale song?
We do. So I mentioned earlier, like the one sound that's been described from them is this bioduck call that's been heard on a lot of passive acoustic recorders in the Antarctic. My wife and I are just about to publish a paper on 4 new call types in Antarctic minke whales. So 4 different calls that had never been heard before, or at least hadn't been prescribed to these animals. And what's really cool about these tags that I've mentioned is that now we know the context. So with the video cameras, we can say, when we heard this call, was the animal by itself? Was it in sea ice? Was it in a group? Was it feeding? What was it doing? And so what's great about these calls is we don't know exactly what they mean. And I'm sure Carolyn, when she talked, sort of talked about understanding the context or what a call means to an animal is very difficult to do. But we can now say, hey, look, the rumble call of a minke whale is only produced when animals are feeding in groups during the day, or a down sweep we only hear at nighttime. And so we can start to hone in on when different types of calls are made, and that gives us some information about what the functionality of that call might be, whether it's to contact another individual and say, hey, I'm over here, where are you? Or is it something that occurs to coordinate feeding? Those are questions that we're starting to be able to address. Yeah.
Nice.
They don't do a song like a humpback whale does. It's more individual, kind of sounds that you hear.
Can you imitate it?
I was going to say, is there any chance you have a little recording of it?
I should. I really
My
should.
wife can do elephant seal.
Yeah, they are far less interesting than an elephant seal call. It would be like you'd hear a little like, whoa, and I'd say, hey, that was a rumble, and you'd be like, that's it. It sounded like your chair squeaked. And they're not beautiful melodic things like a humpback song.
Right. Gotcha. Well, I really want to hear a harbor seal song. People are talking about the meritory that they establish, and that they're down there out singing each other instead of duking it out like elephant seals. And I don't.
Yeah, they make some wild noises.
Just getting that ear under there too is the ear and the sight for us land creatures.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Well, any other questions before we bid you good night? You've had a nice size audience tonight, 25 people, and everybody really enjoying what you're sharing, Ari. And if you are ever up in this area, you and your wife, your family, come
Yes.
visit us.
Absolutely. I would
Bring
love
the
to.
baby.
We'll definitely bring her up. Yeah. She makes some great sounds too these days. So make some recordings of her.
We've got all sorts of appreciative exclamations for you, Ari.
Yeah.
Extraordinary and all of the above. Very interesting, and thank you. And someone is asking also who the predators are, but I think you said orca.
Oh yeah. Yep. Killer
That's,
whales. That's about it.
Killer whales.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it, and I do hope I can stop by next time we're up the coast. And again, if you have questions that come up, feel free to email me. I'd love to hear from you, and I thank you guys for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much.
Thanks everybody for joining us this evening.
All right.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
For our next ones.
We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you.